Well, firstly, thank you very much indeed, and good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It is my very great honour to be here today to speak to you, and I would like to thank everyone at Notre Dame who has made this possible, in particular, Vice President and Associate Provost, Dr. Pippinger. You may know that I was supposed to give this speech earlier in the year, when I was also due to sign an MOU between St Edmund's College and Notre Dame. Unfortunately, COVID stopped me from travelling. But the way we've all embraced technology meant that President Father John Jenkins and I were still able to sign the MOU, sitting 4,000 miles apart. It is, however, such a great pleasure to be here at last, to see your beautiful university, be inspired by the clear passion for higher education in its fullest conception, and to meet so many of you in person. This is not the talk I was originally going to give. I stepped off the aeroplane on Thursday to the news that Her Majesty the Queen had died. So if you will allow me, as someone who spent most of my working life as a Crown servant, which is what the diplomatic service in the UK is, to use the Queen as a starting point for my introductory talk. Her Majesty was not the longest serving monarch in history. That was Louis XIV of France, who became king at the age of 4 and reigned for 72 years. Queen Elizabeth II became queen in 1952 at the age of 26. At her coronation, she pledged that throughout all my life and with all my heart, I shall strive to be worthy of your trust. And for 70 years, she has been for many, many millions across the globe a source of constancy in a world marked by change, conflict, and confusion. For so many, even those who might take intellectual exception to the concept of an unelected head of state, or for whom she was not even queen, she was a presence, a feeling, a link to our better values, service, duty, constancy. Those ingredients that make us worthy of trust. To put her reign into perspective, during the time she was queen, there have been 7 popes, 14 US presidents, and 15 UK prime ministers, and she met all but 3 of them. Before her death, the Queen was the only head of state to have seen service in the Second World War, training and serving as a mechanic and a driver, something that she had been advised against, but which she insisted on doing. Why? Because she knew it was her duty. How can you inspire if you will not be part of the effort, the struggle of those who seek to lead? The Queen's life in her death gives us, therefore, a moment to reflect on change and constancy. To help, I'm going to quote a short extract from 2 things that were written in 1926, the year Her Majesty was born. The first is from the Times newspaper. John L. Baird, who has perfected television after years of continuous research, has been giving practical demonstrations here. When he speaks before the transmitting apparatus in this laboratory, his words can be heard, and the movements of his face clearly seen in another room. His lips may be seen enunciating each word, and the shadows change with his changing expression. The essential thing about television is that it is a living scene, viewed in the instant it is taking place. The second extract comes from the British children's classic, Winnie the Pooh, the original handwritten copy of which is in Cambridge University, and which was also written in 1926. Well, said Pooh, what I like best, and then he had to stop and think, because although eating honey was a very good thing to do, there was a moment just before you began to eat, which was better than when you were, but he didn't know what it was called. All of us recognise immediately that moment that so confused Pooh. As the kaleidoscope of technology changes around us, human nature remains stubbornly constant. And it is in this meeting of change brought about by the things that people think, discover, explore and dream, and the constancy of human nature, that places of research and learning such as ours play such a pivotal role. Ours, where thinkers who will change the next 70 years for all humanity are formed, and which fosters some of the world's greatest minds. The only countries to have more Nobel prize winners than those affiliated with Cambridge University are the US and the UK. Of all the world's heads of state and government, well over 100 were educated in the US or the UK, 58 and 57 respectively at the last count I could find. That is a tremendous responsibility. But it is a responsibility that Notre Dame and St Edmund's College take seriously. The formation of the person, the purpose to which we marshal our intellectual acuity, is as important to nourish as the brilliance of the mind. To understand how I bring the parts of the title of my talk together in my current role, let me give you a little bit more context about St Edmund's College. St Edmund's remains the only full college in Cambridge or Oxford universities with a Roman Catholic dean and chapel. We were founded 126 years ago, and there are three important things from our founding that shape who we are today. The first was the final repeal in the 1870s of the Exclusionary Test Acts. These had seen Roman Catholics, along with other religious minorities, excluded by law from various parts of public life for several centuries. One of the last test acts to be repealed was the one that had excluded Roman Catholics and others from the full life of Cambridge and Oxford universities. With their repeal, a movement started to ensure that there was space for Roman Catholics not simply to enter the University of Cambridge, but to feel welcome, included, and at home. That was the vision of our founders at St Edmund's College, Baron Anatole von Hügel and Father Edmund Noland. However, it was not as simple as that. It seldom is. Together, and with the help of a number of great church thinkers, including Cardinal Newman, they had to challenge and overcome two further powerful views. The first of these was the initial reluctance of the bishops and the Holy See to recognise that access to a secular education and research environment would benefit Catholic scholars, not expose and undermine them and their faith. The second was the vehemence in parts of Cambridge University that those with particular religious perspectives would strangle free thought. The subtext of the Exclusionary Test Acts and the debates that then tried to hold back our founders remain live today. Fear. Fear of change, fear of challenge, fear that loyalties might lie elsewhere. The Catholic founders of St Edmund's confronted those fears to make a clear case that no one should be excluded from the intellectual rigour, challenge and attainment of Cambridge on the basis of who they are or what they believe. They also held that the open meeting of different perspectives is a stimulus to our four charitable objectives: education, religion, learning and research, not a threat. And this is where I believe our past meets our present and our future. At St Edmund's, as here at Notre Dame, we welcome people from all backgrounds, faiths and cultures. As a former diplomat, I believe that to influence and lead today, whether running a multinational corporation, cutting-edge research, or a country, it is not enough to have a world-class degree. Leaders also need strong interpersonal skills, an understanding of issues beyond their area of expertise, and the ability to speak across cultures. We are on a very different scale to you, a college of 1,000 academics and students within the University of Cambridge. But each year we welcome people from over 75 different nationalities, reading for any degree at the University of Cambridge. They come together in 10 leafy acres to learn, live and grow together. We are the world's diversity, but on a human scale, a scale at which profound and transformative encounters can take place, intellectually, personally and spiritually. So yes, I do believe that there is a role for educational establishments to do more than the raw teaching of a degree. US higher education is, in my experience, often better and more comfortable with that than in the UK. And we have much to learn from you. And that is why I think there are few better pointers to what we need to do than that set out by the Blessed Basil Moreau, when he said, "How we educate the mind will change with the times. How we cultivate the heart is and will remain timeless." Today, COVID is only one of many shared global crises, yet we are entering a new era of overt competition and international fragmentation. Globalization has left many communities behind. New platforms and social uncertainties give power to simplistic narratives, foster suspicion and division. Difference is once again viewed by some as a problem, not an opportunity. The fears St Edmund's founders faced, as a religious minority which had been legally marginalised in England, are again on the rise across the world. There is, I think, an urgent need for compelling thinkers and actors who can bridge divides. To use the time at Notre Dame or St Edmund's to develop the skills to do that is one of our great shared and moral duties. As your president has said at Notre Dame, a healing, unifying, enlightening force for a world deeply in need. In 2010, the Queen spoke to the United Nations. At the time, she was head of state for 14 UN member states and head of a Commonwealth of 53 countries. Reflecting on her 60 years of experience of meeting hundreds of politicians, leaders and thinkers, the world's war makers and the world's peacemakers, she said, "It has perhaps always been the case that the waging of peace is the hardest form of leadership of all. I know of no single formula for success, but over the years I have observed that some attributes of leadership are universal and are often about finding ways of encouraging people to combine their efforts, their talents, their insights, their enthusiasm, and their inspiration to work together." Leadership is hard, wherever it is found. Every decision is a choice. Every decision leaves a path not taken, a group disappointed or adversely affected. And today's decision, no matter how considered, might be an abomination not only to your people in 100 years' time, but to people living today just the other side of a real or perceived boundary. And that is why I believe it is so important to form leaders capable of taking conscious choices. Choices that recognise what they mean to themselves and to others. And to be able to do that, leaders, especially those working in a globalised world, must have the tools to enable them to listen and be willing to understand across often profound differences. Part of the role of diplomacy and higher education is, therefore, to find ways to bring people together, to combine their efforts, their talents, their insights, their enthusiasm, and their inspiration to work together, but also to train the heart. Or perhaps to leave the final word on this before my discussion with Michael, to the prayer of St Edmund's, which we use at the formal welcome of all of our students. May we be delivered from fear before new truth, complacency before half-truth, and pride that would claim all truth. Thank you.
I want to start by talking about education as being both a force that brings people together and divides us. You talked about the legacy of the Test Acts and then the repeal. At one point in time, Cambridge was a place where education was meant to exclude, was meant to keep people apart, was meant to deny social access and equity and mobility. How do you see the role of the university in continuing to fight that change now?
I think that's an incredibly important question, Michael. Sorry, can you hear me? I can speak quite loudly, but I don't want to deafen the front row. I think that is an incredibly important question, Michael, and I think anything I'm going to say pithily is going to be superficial, and I recognise there are historical experts in this room who would want to be able to go much deeper. But at some level, why are people excluded? And I think that's exactly the point I tried to make in my talk, usually in my experience, it's fear. Fear because if you give somebody something, it might make them powerful, and you feel threatened by that. And so if we look at some of the undergirding historical contexts in which anyone who wasn't of the established Anglican faith had been excluded from public service and the universities, it was precisely because the universities were seen as the place in which those who would go on to lead within the United Kingdom were formed. And we wanted to make sure that those who were taking advantage of those opportunities and going on into those leadership positions were people who we could trust, people who we didn't fear. And I think that is at the heart of the negative side of the positive in my answer to your question, which is the power of higher education was precisely the reason for that exclusion. And I think, therefore, harnessing that power to ensure that concepts and understandings of the value of diversity, the true value of diversity, not just manuals and guidebooks and legislation that we need to follow, is part of what the Academy needs to do so that we break down the barriers of suspicion and fear and we genuinely find collective and common perceptions of the future, which mean that we actively do not wish to exclude. I think one of the things that St Edmund's has always stood for is an inclusivity that seeks to go beyond any definitions of the moment. And therefore, other than to say that the UK would like to self-identify as a country in which values of freedom of expression, values of intellectual curiosity, values of wishing to understand the other, values in which pluralism is taken seriously, I don't think St Edmund's sees itself as part of a project that is nation building. Now, those of you who aren't British, which is most of the audience, may not see the UK in this way, because one of the things that I love about diplomacy and travelling around the world is that one can always see the other in a light and perspective which you can never see yourself. And therefore the interplay between self-perception and the mirror that others hold up to you is very, very important. But I think one of the things that has been central to political discourse within the United Kingdom for the entirety of my life, and to be honest, for most of the Queen's reign, if we use that 70 years as a time frame, is what the role of the UK is over and against a self-definition that was for a long time one of empire. And, you know, I'm not seeking to unpack a particular facet of that, but if you have had an empire that was the largest in the history of the world, and then suddenly you are a rainy island off the north coast of Europe, that is bound to trigger a long period of soul-searching. And therefore I think we are inherently, and Brexit was a very interesting inflection in what I'm about to say, we are inherently a little bit sceptical about anything that might define us as a nation. And so politician after politician will come up with different projects. David Cameron had the concept of big society, again, deliberately amorphously defined so that it could be capacious, because our horizons were still, and are still actually in some level, global, while also being constrained within a very small geography. And so in that sense, I think if St Edmund's is part of something that is explicitly British, it is that sense that actually we really want to tap into the diversity of the world, because it is only in so doing that the world itself will be more thoughtful, more reflective, and a place in which everyone can be contained. And I mean, very practically, only 35% of the student body of St Edmund's is British. So perforce, we are global. And that's how we would want to self-define. And I think that's, for me, the true value of everything we're seeking to do at St Edmund's is that Catholicity, that universality, that moment where people from over 75 different nationalities per year, most of whom have never lived outside their own culture, have that incredible moment when they realize how profoundly differently we do see the world. And then that even more powerful moment after that, when you realize how once one moves beyond that, how profoundly similar we are. We all have that Pooh Bear moment, because that is what it is to be human. But I'd love to hear, somewhere like Notre Dame, when you're thinking of the global gateways, the work that Notre Dame and indeed the Holy Cross are doing globally, what's your answer to that question, Michael?
Sure, I appreciate you asking that. I think that you're a model at St. Edmund's of what it means to think about Catholicity in a new way, right? Here, our international population is remarkably small. We hover at about 7% for the undergraduate population. When you think about that compared to your only 35% of your students are British, that leads to a series of questions about what it means to be Catholic, what it means to embrace a more capacious view of a community. What we're trying to do, certainly with the gateways and the centers, is to have them be nodes that can attract people, places where people who might not be familiar with Notre Dame can learn about who we are and what our global project is, and how they can bring their own gifts, strengths, and talents to bear on the research and scholarship that's produced here. I think when we think about Notre Dame being of service to the church and the world, that's something we're talking about in our new strategic plan. We want to be a place that attracts those parts of the world, people from those parts of the world that we have not traditionally attracted them to come here to be a part of that project. And I think that's one thing that's interesting about universities, and they're a place to experiment and build new communities, to build a different understanding of what it means to be a research community, a scholarly community. And globalization does that in a way, I think, that no other project can. Our provost, John McGreevy, often talks about the most international organization in the world is, of course, the Catholic Church. And that's what we're talking about in part when we talk about Catholicity. You mentioned in your remarks about religion being important in the development of the university. And I'm wondering what you think about that in 2022, in the 21st century, what it means to have a Catholic legacy amidst an Anglican institution like Cambridge, and how that affects how you see internationalism, how you see your leadership in bringing the university to a new place or a new understanding of what an education can be.
So part of what I see within St. Edmund's as the legacy of and the present, so if you look at that foundational narrative, and most organizations take their foundation, and you can take them in multiple directions. There's a mythology around a foundation. And I think the mythology, which is also grounded in fact, but the story we tell ourselves is one of a recognition of the space for faith within the academy, which has not always been accepted within the University of Cambridge. Obviously, its original foundations 800 years ago were religious, profoundly so, but there have been periods, as I say, particularly when we were looking to be founded, where there was a deep skepticism that religion perforce, going back to my point about fear, that religion perforce would be strangling the ability to think freely, because there were a priori beliefs which may stop you from going in certain directions. And therefore, our founders convinced the university that not only were we not a threat, but that we were actually a benefit to the collegiate university identity. But I think it's also meant that we are unusually comfortable as a college with the concept of scholarship programs, for example, that will be linked to particular faith communities. Because part of our Catholic mission is not simply a Roman Catholic identity, but it is a recognition that that struggle that our Roman Catholic founders faced is one that today other religious communities face, and therefore we must be the space in Cambridge for that flourishing of faith and academia. So we have scholarships for the British Hindu community, for the British Muslim community, and we're just launching a new scholarship this year for the British Jewish community. And so I think that's really where we are important, and particularly through the work that Vittorio Montemaggi leads as director of the Hügel Institute, which is an institute of advanced Catholic critical inquiry within St Edmunds, is that sense of what is the prism of Catholicity through which we can look at different aspects of academia, whether that's artificial intelligence, whether that's Shakespeare and the common good, whether that is looking at disability and perception, but it is also the way in which we bring people of other faiths into that conversation, both within the college, but also as part of the collegiate university. So constantly reasserting that it does not need to be either or, it can be both and.
I appreciate that both and, because I think it's one of the things we talk a lot about here at Notre Dame, this notion that an education, in effect, is meant to cultivate faith and reason together simultaneously, one affording and informing the other. But there's such a fundamental distrust in contemporary society about the notion that faith and reason can, in fact, coexist, and that faith won't somehow co-opt it. In that sense, it's no different from the 19th century in the remarks that you gave. And I'm wondering if we could talk a little bit about the ways in which you see that fear and distrust play itself out. You've also been an ambassador on top of being the master of the college. What role do you think faith has in making people fearful in public society? And how might education combat that at places like St. Edmunds or Notre Dame?
I mean, again, I fear that my remarks in the time available are going to skate over an exceptionally complicated problem. I think one of the things that's fascinating as a British diplomat, and again, I'm going to assert that British component, is that the UK is a profoundly secular society. And we have this extraordinary distance. So let me digress, and then I promise I will come back. One of the things when I was in Iran, and it goes back to my point about mirrors that other people hold up to you. It's one of the most important things is to listen, because how others perceive you matters. And one of the most extraordinary things for British diplomats in Iran is the discovery that with a high degree of authenticity, Iranians genuinely believe we have identical political systems. And, that's quite confronting to start off with. And then you ask them why. And they basically say, well, we've got a parliamentary democracy with elections. You have the House of Lords, an unelected body, which includes a certain number of bishops. And we have the Guardian Council, which is made up of Ayatollahs. And the reason for both of those is precisely because of a political philosophy that believes that those who have spent a lifetime contemplating what religion might mean within the context of society will have something to say about the transitory political decisions that a democratic parliament will take. And then at the top, you have the Queen. Back then, we had the Queen. We now have the King, who is the defender of the faith, the head of the Church of England. And we have the Supreme Leader, who is the head of the religious establishment, as well as being the head of state. And so we have identical systems. My digression there is because one of the peculiarities about the UK is that we do simultaneously have a head of state who is also the head of the state religion, and yet we are so profoundly secular that even having a conversation about religion in the political sphere almost doesn't happen. I mean, there is the famous quote which Tony Blair made, which is, we don't do God. Or it was rather Alistair Campbell who made it of Tony Blair, we don't do God. Now, self-evidently one does, and not many years later, Tony Blair converted to Catholicism. He profoundly did do God, but it was completely not acceptable for him to say so in the public sphere and still expect to be elected. So that's one of the peculiarities about the UK, is that we have the question that you're asking sits within that context in which you have a very secular society, in which you have this interesting state and religion coalescing, and at the same time we're not talking about religion in our public discourse. And then you go overseas as a diplomat and you realise that most of the rest of the world is highly religious, that religion informs multiple levels of decisions. And I think as a British diplomat, people will often say of our political system, and therefore by force our civil service, that we dismiss religion. I can honestly say I have never met a member of the British diplomatic service who dismisses religion. The problem is we don't actually know how to deal with it. And therefore it is much easier to collapse a religious imperative into a proxy for economics or a proxy for politics than actually seek to try to understand what the person is really saying. So to go all the way back to your original question, that is what I think in the UK context, somewhere like St Edmund's and higher education per se must do, is just if we are to operate and to lead in a globalized world, even if one is highly secular, an atheist, it doesn't really matter how one self-defines, to fail to be able to appreciate something that profoundly motivates the majority of the world's population is a single failure. And therefore, in bringing together people from so many different backgrounds into this experience of the college education, in which faith can be openly expressed and a lack of faith be openly expressed, that is where you start to be able to listen in order to understand, in order to influence across difference.
When you were just answering that question, you were talking there at the end about going out into the world and realizing that people are talking about religion and making choices, either governmental choices or economic choices, or choices about gender and status in the world through a religious lens, through a theological lens. And I was thinking as you were saying that was part of the conversation we had here when we discussed about starting the Keough School of Global Affairs. This notion that there are many global affairs schools, international policy schools around the country and around the world, but who is actually taking seriously in those scholarly discourses the idea that integral human development matters, that people are guided by choices that sometimes have a theological dimension or a sociological dimension as it regards a religion. And I think that is part of what propelled us to move forward with creating that, to fill that void and to work in the world in a different way. And that hopefully leads us to be a leader in that discussion, to reimagine how religion can play a role in both civil discourse, free speech, policy-making decisions, and allowing everyone access to education in a new way.
And when you see its outworkings here, where's that journey taken Notre Dame?
I think that's a great question. I think it's taken us into a space where we're trying to make the case that scholarship and research can be done in the service of both advancing a better understanding of what motivates people to act in the religious and public sphere, and that there's scholarship still to be done that other places are not doing. I'm looking, where is Clemens? Clemens, where are you? Clemens Sedbak, the director of our Hügel Institute, right? We've been working assiduously with colleagues from Ukrainian Catholic University. Taras is here, the provost there, the vice rector of UKU in Lviv. And one of the things we've been talking about is when you think about the ways in which Catholicism or religion can play a role in healing civil society and moving people forward to talk about everything from ethical business practices to rebuilding a country, that work requires the university to understand the roles that a church or a religious educational institution or a religious political body can play in that role. I think we have a unique purchase on that because of what's going on in the Keough School, because of our international and global partnerships. And I think that's something we share, right, between St. Edmund's and Notre Dame, that we fundamentally do believe that we're creating leaders who will be global citizens. You talked in your speech about we're training people, I think the phrase you used was, we're training ethical leaders to make conscious decisions.
Yes, yes.
Those conscious decisions, I'm curious how you see that. Are those ethical decisions made in a purely ethical lens? Do you see them as having a faith-based component, or how do you see that?
So, in all of my interactions over probably the past 10 or 15 years through my career, I've been really interested in this concept of conscious choice. And I think it stemmed from two observations. The first was a purely practical observation that in an institution like the Foreign Office, so I had come from the City of London, so the sort of finance world, where the answer to every problem was a bonus or you lost your job. And so there was a very, very clear carrot and stick methodology. And then I moved into the Foreign Office, which had no carrot and almost no stick. And so you almost had to sort of get into the psychology of every individual within your team to better understand how to motivate and inspire them, which actually does lead, I think, to the Foreign Office and organisations like it having a far higher quality of leadership. But one of the things I noticed was that instead of understanding the choices that people had taken, people would bank the things that worked for them and then still moan. Brits love moaning. And you know, a thing that came back quite often was, oh, I really don't like doing this, and I really don't like that, and I can't believe something else. But, you know, I can't leave the Foreign Office because my children are at school. And then I'd sort of say, well, flip it and say, well, what is the choice you've then taken? Tell me about your children at school. Tell me about what the benefit of that is. And then suddenly they'd light up. And so the whole concept for me of this conscious choice comes from something that is very specific and very personal. Every time you take a decision about your career, every time you decide not to leave something or to leave something, what really are the choices that you're taking so that you can feel much more positive about yourself as you move forward? But actually, this is how leadership decisions, I think, need to be taken anyway. The more power you have, the more you realise that there is no right or wrong answer. There is no solution or response that will have universal approbation. There is nothing usually that you can do that will not leave somebody outside. And that is something that you need consciously to confront. And I think this is what I mean about this listening in order to understand, in order to influence, and then to take these profound and difficult decisions. I think you owe it to those who will be excluded. You owe it to those who will not seek the maximum benefit from the decision that you have taken, that you have thought about the impact of what you are doing on them, and still been willing to take that choice.
And that brings us back to this notion of inclusion and equity that we talked about at the start, right? By making conscious choices, potentially you're speaking and making decisions on behalf of people who don't have a voice, but you want to bring into a larger conversation and give them their own voice in the future.
But you're right about the point about ethics, because the whole concept of what I've described with conscious choice is predicated on the fact that undergirding that consciousness is an ethic that means you care.
I want to stay on leadership a little bit longer, and then we'll open it up to the audience. I've listened to a podcast where you've talked about women in leadership.
Yes.
You were recognized by the Queen and granted an OBE, Order of British Empire. You're recognized as a leader both in the diplomatic sphere and in the educational sphere. What do you see the role of women being in leading institutions that promote social change, and what has your own experience been like as a female leader?
The first thing I always say on this subject is that I genuinely don't believe that there is a right or a wrong way of answering this question. And I think that's part of the empowerment of whichever group it is one is talking to, that there is not a right way to have to see the benefits and the disbenefits, the challenges, the opportunities of being a woman in leadership, or indeed replace woman with any other category that one might choose. Personally, people often ask me whether my experience in the Middle East in particular has been challenging as a woman. And I can honestly say that the answer to that question is no. In part, large part, because I'm lucky, and I recognise that luck. But I always say it's been a benefit, because there are still parts of societies where a man cannot go, but where a woman, particularly with a position in something such as an embassy, has access to almost everywhere that a man can. So in a way, women are very lucky. So I just think it goes back to representation. I mean, this feels like such a basic answer. 50% of the world's population is female. 50% of the world's population is male, and a high-quality decision must therefore be taken by people from all backgrounds. There are people who identify as neither of those categories. They also need to be represented. So without getting into too much detail in this area, where I realise there are many, many different perspectives, it just seems basic to me that if there are people out there, then they need representation in the decisions that will affect their lives. And when 50% of the world identifies as being a woman, then we need to be taking decisions. I worry, and you can therefore already see which part of this answer I'm giving to, I am not for 1 minute suggesting that there are not differences in the way men and women perceive the world. I am not academically able to tell you how much those are culture versus innate, and therefore I do personally get slightly uncomfortable when people assume at the table that I'm going to be the conciliator or the peacemaker. Mm-hmm. That said, if you look around the world at peace and reconciliation programs, the power of the female voice within them is undeniable.
Perfect. One last question, and then we'll open it up. The original topic was diplomacy, religion, education in the 21st century. What's your vision as the master of St. Edmund's College for the college 50 years from now, 100 years from now, long after we're both gone? What would you hope the college is a testament to based on your work now?
So I was having a conversation with somebody a few days ago about a not dissimilar question. So I'm going to start with my answer to them.
Okay.
Which was when Lady Margaret Beaufort, again going back to powerful women throughout history, endowed St. John's College and Christ's College, which are two of the oldest colleges in Cambridge, she could not even have begun to imagine the sorts of questions and the sorts of people who are now beneficiaries of what she did. Now, I'm not for 1 minute suggesting that there's any comparison between Lady Margaret Beaufort and myself, but I think the profound point there is the real excitement of somewhere like the University of Cambridge and like Notre Dame is that Cambridge has 800 years of history, and one would hope 800 years of future. And therefore, it's actually unimaginable what one's legacy might be. But I think the one thing that I would hope that we had left is almost to go back to Basil Moreau, is that point that whatever, there will be different intellectual needs, there will be different problems, different solutions, but some of that human constancy, that training of the heart, so that when people take those conscious choices, it is founded on something more than themselves and is reflective of a common good that in my mind I would hope would be as capacious as we can ever define that to be, would be what I would love our legacy.
That's a really beautiful sentiment, and I'm thinking about your question earlier about Holy Cross, the Congregation of Holy Cross, and one of the things that motivated Holy Cross in going out into the world was this notion of accompaniment, that as Holy Cross priests or religious, they would go out into the world, they would be together with those that they met, and in that accompaniment would learn together and then be able to work together for the common good, which I think is what this international partnership between Notre Dame and St. Edmund's at Cambridge is about. What questions do you have for Ambassador Arnold, either about what we've talked about and said, or about something that hasn't come up yet? Welcome that. Clements and then Judy.
Oh, Judy first.
Judy first and then Clements. Judy.
Thank you, Ambassador. First of all, my condolences on the loss.
Thank you.
It hit me hard too. I'm going to apologize. I want to tell you a bit of a little story. I'll try to do it quickly and ask you to comment on it. I lived in London several times in the 90s, working for a much smaller program that was not yet a gateway for Notre Dame, and was a member of Westminster Cathedral Parish, and they celebrated their sesquicentennial and invited Her Majesty the Queen. It was a huge historical event, obviously because of English Reformation history, and I didn't realize that. And I went in and was sitting next to two, I'm going to call them elderly, although they were my age at that time, women who were just, everybody was on pins and needles, and there were people protesting out in the square in Victoria in front of the church, handing out flyers saying you're betraying your coronation oath by attending this. It had been hundreds of years since head of state had attended, I think, a Catholic service. And I was stunned by that because it was 1996, I think. I'm like, what? You know, I mean, really? You still hate Catholics here? And when she walked in, it was dead quiet, and then, I'm not going to call it raucous, this is England, but huge applause. It went on forever. And both of the women and several other people around me were just sobbing, crying. And I'll never forget the one lady told me later, she said, she's our queen too. And in that moment of her attending that service, she seemed to have, just by her presence, healed a rift, at least amongst those people. What I learned that day was that there was very strong anti-Catholic feelings still, and that the Brits seem to have very long memories about the history. I'm wondering, taking it back to St. Edmund's with your Catholic character and identity, and Cambridge, you know, having a more Protestant identity, is there any of that still? I mean, it was 20-some years ago, so maybe things are better. But by the way, it was the most amazing experience of my life. But is that, do you sense that, do you face that, or is it because it's an educational community that, you know, maybe people are sort of, and much more secular than it used to be, people have kind of passed that? Thanks.
So I think thank you very much for sharing that story. I mean, I think that really brings to life so many different points that I've made far less pithily. The first is the power of leadership. The fact that, you know, the Queen, not only in that moment, but in her her work and visits to Ireland, had taken upon herself a role that in many ways only she could, to heal various rifts which were and are still there. But that power of example, which very few of us ever have the opportunity, but in having that opportunity, the fact that she took it says something. And so part of the formation process is that we don't know where our students are going to go. But the nature of coming to Cambridge or coming to somewhere like Notre Dame means that they will go on, that the likelihood is someone in the next 100 years, going back to your question, Michael, will become a head of state, a head of government, and one would want them to be able to take the same bold, brave decisions to reach out in order to heal these rifts. I think the second point I would make is I have never experienced anything in the last 3 years of being at St. Edmund's, and I'm looking to Victoria to see, and Thomas and Bridget, to see if this is borne out by their experience, in which there is any antipathy towards the college because of its Catholic heritage. If anything, there's a curiosity, which is nearly always positive. And if it's negative, it isn't actually negative. It's a curiosity as to why this would be relevant, which and then, of course, begs the question to which we can provide an answer and then have a conversation that follows. And I do think that a lot of the work that's happened over the last 25 years, particularly with Northern Ireland and, you know, some of the fears that people have at the moment with some of what's happening now, have healed many of those underlying wounds that I think when you're talking would have still felt much more present because of acts of atrocity in many directions that had taken place in much more recent history.
Thanks for the question. Clemens.
Thank you. Thank you for your visit here. Welcome to Notre Dame. I have two questions, if I may, small ones. You have been an ambassador, diplomat, now you are a university administrator. And I'm curious how you compare those two roles in terms of the freedoms you have, the red tape you have to face, the hierarchies you have to negotiate. So how do you see in having both worlds? When I always listen to my critics, I admire your diplomatic skills. I mean, Mike would be a diplomat just
Not true, Clemens. Not true.
And my second question is about, so the Hügel School of Global Affairs is quite young, and we are trying to explore some courses in diplomacy. And my question is, if you were to design a curriculum on diplomacy, what would your focus areas be? What would you do?
Wonderful questions, Clemens. So, for those of you who don't understand Cambridge governance, I'm not even going to try because I'm not sure there's anyone in Cambridge who understands Cambridge governance. But to just put it in context, a college is a self-standing, independently registered charity. And then the university is run by the Vice-Chancellor and regulated by a completely different regulatory body, just to sort of put it into perspective. And my pithiest answer to your first question is a conversation I had with the Vice-Chancellor probably about 3 or 4 weeks ago, where I said I felt that the biggest mistake that I had made in coming to St Edmunds in Cambridge was making the assumption that I was moving from one large British bureaucracy to another large British bureaucracy. And that really what I should have done was assume I was going on a foreign posting. Because Cambridge is very differently run. And I think if I'd approached it like a completely different country and culture, I would have done things slightly differently. So how do I find it? I think that's the sort of the key thing is much is the same, but I think there is much that is more different than I would have expected in terms of simply how a massive bureaucracy runs itself. In terms of freedoms, I think that it is interesting. So in the Foreign Office, you are self-evidently constrained. I mean, nobody knows what I think on Brexit because it's not appropriate as a diplomat to let anyone know, because ultimately I am an impartial civil service servant. And the big difference between the British diplomatic service and the American diplomatic service, which in many ways is otherwise identical when I'm dealing with American colleagues, is that at the moment I believe we only have one ambassador who could be considered to be in any way a political appointee. All the rest of us are civil servants, and therefore all the way to the top of our tree we are impartial, and critically that is why we are crown servants. Along with the military and a few other organs of state, we answer ultimately to the Queen via the government of the day rather than the government of the day, so to keep that impartiality. But impartial or not, that means that you are self-censoring a lot of the time. I think it's fair to say that as Master of St Edmunds, I could wake up tomorrow and get away with saying anything I wanted to. No one would stop me because there is no one to stop me. But I am not sure that that would be a very effective form of leadership. So to some extent, the way I operated as an ambassador or as a diplomat is very similar to how I operate as Master of St Edmunds. But I think it would be fair to say that that is a personal choice, an expedient personal choice, I would say, rather than something that somebody else has imposed on me. In terms of your second question, gosh, well, I think maybe we should discuss it in more detail tomorrow, but I'm going to cast the question the other way. What is it in diplomacy courses that I think is missing from the reality of being a diplomat? And I think it is that side of diplomacy which has absolutely nothing to do with international relations or international relation theory. It is that side of diplomacy that is somewhere between being a journalist, an advocacy organisation, and an advertiser. Because you are having to navigate all the time between big international relations frameworks and individual people at the level of that you would expect from a journalist. You are having to advocate on behalf of multiple constituencies. When you are an ambassador overseas, you technically represent everything your country could perceive itself to be. And so you are constantly advocating within these big frameworks. And then ultimately, you're selling your country. And I always used to say this in the Foreign Office, and a lot of people really hated it when I said it, is that being a diplomat, effectively, is being a really effective salesperson. Because it doesn't matter whether you're trying to sell a truck as part of your trade indices, or whether you're selling the value of a human life. You're trying to convince somebody else to see the world in the way that you do. And that does go back to my fundamental of listening in order to understand, in order to influence.
Yes, Father Matt.
Ambassador, good to see you again.
And
Thank
you.
for coming. I was really struck by the prayer that you shared from St. Edmund about the particular part that we might not be complacent
Yes.
and accept half-truth. I find in my country, the United States, we're often quick to do that, especially with the media we consume. And the very limited experience I've had in the UK, I wonder if that's a similar kind of case. So given education's ability to capture people's attention, and especially faith as well, how might we work against complacency, keeping in mind that our history today is different than in the past when both of our countries ended slavery, for example. Religion was a huge part of that. We don't express it perhaps the same way we did then. So how might we fulfill that prayer and work against complacency?
Trying to think how to give you a high enough quality answer to such a good question. And I think my answer is rather simplistically going to go back to my point about conscious choices. Even the choice about when we act and when we say silent is a choice. And it's one that we need to take consciously. Because those who are full of sound and fury can often signify nothing. And I'm equally struck by Yeats' poem, The Second Coming, which many of you may know. The best lack all conviction, the worst are filled with passionate intensity. And so ensuring that the best can have conviction and can speak is so important. And therefore I'm not going to be able to give you an answer because I don't think that there is one. But it is about recognizing the complexity of every moment, and that there are moments to act and there are moments to stay silent. And even in that same moment, it may be right for some to act and some to stay silent. But I think the most important thing of all is that that conscious choice has been taken so that we know what we are doing. And indeed, we know that what we are doing even when we are choosing to do nothing, because even inaction has a consequence.
That's a really interesting observation, the notion that education might prepare someone to be silent, or that education might prepare someone to do nothing. We don't often talk about those kinds of configurations, but in fact, they are a means to understanding and action and change. So thank you for that. Other questions that people have? Yes, Angie. Hello.
Bear with me as I try to kind of formulate my question. I'm curious about your faculty. And so my observation here at Notre Dame, obviously we're a Catholic institution rooted in a deep mission. We consider it big C and little c, very inclusive of different religions or perhaps no faith tradition. But yet we are Catholic and unapologetic about that. Students come and go, but faculty remain. How do you help to cultivate your faculty as agents of this conscious choice or this moral ethic, formational approach to teaching and coaching and mentoring, particularly if those faculty members themselves aren't necessarily rooted in or maybe even reject a religious tradition that is, say, obviously Edmund, but also with Cambridge being secular. I'm just curious how you think about that and approaches with faculty particularly.
So it's an excellent question. So if I just sort of frame what the college is, again, I don't want to sort of go into too much of this detail. They're rabbit holes. Trying to understand how Cambridge works is a rabbit hole. So a college is a combination of students who are studying within the University of Cambridge and academics who are, majority of whom, are within multiple faculties across the university, and then some who aren't within the university and may not even be academics. So what I'm going to count as what you're terming our faculty, I'm going to call our fellowship, which is basically a combination of academics, the majority of whom are across the University of Cambridge, some of whom are academics outside the University of Cambridge, and some of whom aren't academics at all. They're sort of leaders within their professional field. And the honest answer, I would say, to your question is that in recent years, it has been fairly organic. And I think a lot of the work that we as a community have been doing over the last year will enable us to create a framework into which it will be more obvious how people choose to come to us and why. And then, as we're having fit interviews, etc., it will be more obvious what the questions we're asking just to test whether there is a fit. But, and part of this is a framework that we've developed over the last year, which, as a community, which says that we want everyone to thrive, and the thrive is an acronym. We all love acronyms, which stands for trust, higher purpose, resilience, imagination, voice, and enjoyment. And so firmly in there is the higher purpose, and that sense that that this is a community in which you will want to have a higher purpose, you will want to give back and serve the common good, however and through whichever religious or non-religious optic you look at. So that will make it a little bit more framed going forward. But I think the really fascinating thing was, as we went through this process, it was authentically bottom-up. We brought in external facilitators, so there could be no sort of internal sense that it was being manipulated. And what came very authentically through, both from those within the college who would identify as Catholic and those who would identify as another faith, and indeed those who would identify as no faith at all, was this sense that came back time and time again of purpose, of ethics, of common good, of something that was more than the self, more than the moment of academic and intellectual acuity. There was something that said, and so what? Where does this take us in the world? And that, therefore, I think this is a really basic response to your question, which is whenever you look at theories of leadership and organisational theories, there is always that sense of tone. And therefore, somewhere in the tone of the college, in the stories that we tell ourselves, in the centrality of the chapel to the experience within the college, which is where everyone gets admitted within our chapel, and key moments of your college life will take place there. There is something that was coursing through the blood of the college that meant that absolutely spontaneously what we would have probably wanted to self-define as was what people were telling us they were, including students who had only arrived 1 or 2 months previously. And so the question that we are now facing, which is where I think we have so much to learn from Notre Dame and indeed from higher education within America, full stop, because I was authentic in what I said. I think the UK's higher education system is quite organic. We are very good at the academic side of the training, and we almost leave everything else to chance to some extent. People would say that was very unfair. It sometimes feels like that. That part of what we're trying to do in St Edmunds is just begin to enable the best of what is organic, the magic, to just spring forth where you can't expect it and you can't plan it, but just also make sure that there are touch points at which we do bring people back to these questions so that we can learn from each other. I mean, an incredible conversation that Vittorio led on forgiveness in different religious traditions, and you really felt that everyone who left that seminar left with a profoundly different understanding, not simply of forgiveness in different religious and cultural traditions, but of what it is to be human. And that is the point, that point of recognition of the commonality and the difference, such that you are open to navigating the complexity that that breeds.
That education actually is not just to the individual student or colleague who's there, but it's educating and forming the entire community. So the community is transformed even as the individual is transformed.
And finding more practical opportunities. That's exactly what we're doing in the year coming, is how do we find the practical opportunities so that we take one of our academics, for example, who is works out of the British Antarctic Survey and is one of the world's preeminent thinkers in particular aspects of climate change. How do we take that academic understanding to bring it into a community in which we have people from around the world who will be profoundly affected as sea level rises? And how do we actually hear those voices so that we can all better understand what this may mean for communities across the globe going forward?
I think we have time for one more question. Yes, please. And if you can introduce yourself, that would be great.
Hello, my name is Maxwell. I'm writing an article for the Observer student newspaper. I would like to ask, based on your discussion earlier, as well as your very clear, evident, comprehensive understanding of our university and how it's very purpose and Catholic oriented, if you were to give advice to the students of Notre Dame in relation to your speech earlier today, what advice would you give them?
Thank you.
Thank you. It's such a lovely question. I think my first piece of advice would be don't ever listen to one person's piece of advice. But I think it would lead from that, which is seek out opportunities to find people who you think are very different to you, and then ask them questions. And when you don't understand what the answer is, keep pretending that you're two again and just keep saying why. Because it's amazing what you'll learn and uncover.
Thank you.
I think that's a great place to end. Please join me in thanking Ambassador Catherine Arnold.